Joining me today on Eloquently Her is Eithne Leming. She's a founder of Gemstones, an education consultancy. Eithne, thanks so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you.
I'd like to know a little bit more about your journey into the world of education. Obviously, you set out as a teacher before you then led into developing your own business. How did that come about, and was education a natural path for you throughout your life?
I'm not sure it was initially, because as a child I was not really a promising student, and I had a lot of things that got in the way of me really learning very well, and I think it was my mother particularly who would not accept that I was going to be bottom of the pile. And so she always had this expectation that I would do well, despite what appeared in the early days, the evidence to the contrary. So I think a lot was down to my mother and her attitude. So I had some sort of mental health difficulties of my own early on, sort of compulsive, obsessive disorder and so on. And anyway, I think what it did do though was it gave me a real insight into how someone that perhaps isn't thought of as being a natural student can overcome these barriers. That actually you can't always tell from a very young child, even from a teenager, how successful they're going to be. And so I think what it did was it made me think. I had come across some good teachers, some really good teachers, and it made me think, well, perhaps I can do well with those students who don't look very promising.
See, you have at one stage in your life, you have been a head teacher. You have been in that more sort of classic role as in education.
I have.
Tell me about how that process led into where you are today.
Yeah, I think I always I had a very varied career in education. So I did start out as a teacher, but I taught all ages from 3 to 19 at some point. I worked in the local education authority with leading projects across the county here in Suffolk, although I have worked in London as well. And I think what happened was I wanted always to understand and to keep that breadth of education. So I always had an interest in children with special needs, but I knew that actually you needed to keep them in society in some way, shape or form. And so it was my, I suppose, view about social justice, about equality of opportunity, and I did lots of different jobs, and then when I became a head teacher I was actually a head of a pupil referral unit, which is for children that are either at risk of exclusion or have been excluded. And I also set up a behaviour support service in Suffolk. And that was important because what I really felt was that these children, we were working with young children, primary age children, sometimes very young children, and primarily, and we knew that these children, the expectation was that they'd go back to school. So you really needed to keep your eye on, right, this is us and we do this specialist work with these children, but actually they've got to go back into school. And therefore you have to work really ideally with the schools and with the families so that other things around the child change as well as the child.
So it is very much holistic. It's not about saying we only have a problem with the child. It's about looking at what's the family environment, what's the external influences.
Yeah, that's right. It's what we would call a systemic approach to, I suppose, the area of special needs, to school improvement, and the two do link together very much so. And then I did that job for 5 years, and we got a lot of success, a lot of interest in what we were doing. But really, I felt the time had come to kind of move on to other things. And I hadn't really seen myself as a business person. Although I had worked in the commercial sector and the charitable sector at times earlier in my career. So it wasn't unknown, that sector, to me. And I was surprised how quickly I took to it, really. I can remember even before I took that step, I can remember we'd have advisors would come in and see us, and there were at least 2 of them that asked me what experience I had of business, because they said the approach I took to setting up the PRU and the way that I wrote my school development plans looked very business orientated. And so maybe I always had that kind of attitude, but I just wasn't aware of it.
So did you surprise yourself?
I did. Oh, very much so. I'm still surprised to this day. I'm still surprised.
So there's that element of surprise, but would you go so far as to say, do you or have you suffered what lots of us talk about as women, the impostor syndrome? Do you relate to that?
Yes, yes. I mean, all the time. I mean, every stage in my career, I can say, as a teacher, I used to think, oh, this is a great job, and but actually, is someone going to tap me on the shoulder and say, well, sorry, we made this mistake. The same when I became a head teacher, very much so. And then when I went into the business world, I just kept thinking, how did I get here? And really just amazed that I'd, taken the step, because, that seemed like it was quite a courageous thing to do. And secondly, I kept thinking, well, I'm not really the same as, say, the other business people in a room if I went to a networking meeting, because, they've actually set out to work in business, and I never started my path thinking I'm going to set up a business.
But to some extent, do you think that gives you even more empathy and...
Yeah, well, I've found, as I've often found, as I've kind of moved through different stages, that I have more in common with the people around me than I ever imagined until I took that particular step. And then I suppose you come and then kind of reappraise yourself and think, well, these are the things that I have in common. So I suppose, therefore, it's not surprising that I've found myself in a room of people who actually are like-minded, in my assessment anyway. So I think that I've come to appreciate that I do have things in common with people in business, and no doubt that's why then I have managed to be successful.
So tell me a little bit about some of the work that Gemstones is doing today and the difference it's making to the lives of children.
Yeah, my Gemstones business is my kind of, what I think of as my payback business. It's the business that I think I really feel especially motivated and passionate about. And it's because, again, it goes back to my feelings of my values of social justice, really. And I felt when I left my job, although it was the right time to leave when I was ahead and take that step into business, I felt that there was still unfinished business. I thought at the time that was as far as I could go in that job. But I left with a sort of reluctant feeling in some ways that I was leaving behind work that was particularly important to me. And so Gemstones, yes, I did found the business, but I have 2 very able directors that work with me, both of whom are ex-head teachers. So the 3 of us have clearly got a lot of experience. One of them, Sue Chesworth, came from a special school background. David Fox comes from a primary background. But we all felt very strongly that for the group of children that Gemstones aims to support, who have social, emotional and mental health difficulties, that actually what was on offer was not good enough.
So you felt there was a potential that lots of children would be falling through a gap in mainstream education?
And that schools actually wanted support, but they weren't getting the right kind of support. And so we felt that we had some different kind of solutions, I suppose, for them. And we wanted to offer that as an alternative to schools. And these will be schools that work particularly hard to keep some of these children, and who feel sometimes that they're left as the only agency that's really effectively providing a service.
So you work with the school,
Yeah.
you work with the teaching body. Presumably
Yeah.
you also work with the parents directly?
Yes, and again, that's where our service seems to be very different from other services. And that's what schools tell us, that use our service. They say that actually our work with parents is particularly important to them. And I think, so sometimes there are perhaps, if you can get them, a service from, say, social care or from the child and adolescent mental health services, which might undertake to do a limited piece of work with a family. But as I always say to the heads, the thing is that, and sometimes they undertake to do that work with a child as well. But what I always say to schools is that these agencies have their own particular agendas that they're working to. They have whatever it is that drives the funding of their service. They're the boxes they've got to tick. And actually, what Gemstones uniquely does is it will come at it from, we're all educationalists, but with therapeutic kind of training on top of our experience and training in schools and education, and therefore we come at it as these are the things that need to be in place so that this child can learn. So the work that we would do with the family will always really have the same agenda as the school, and I think that's where we are different.
I'm interested to know, when we talk about behavioural issues amongst children, is it something that has become worse, or is it more commonly talked about?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think there are certainly evidence that certain kinds of difficulties in special needs have been on the rise. So things like autism, or sometimes called ASD. Sometimes things like, there are lots and lots of labels. So there's been a proliferation of labels. So like you can have ADHD, ODD, there's a whole list of them. But I think also there are, so there is evidence that those have been on the rise. But there's also, I think, increasing evidence that aspects of poverty create social, emotional and mental health difficulties. And I think as the increasing numbers of children experiencing poverty, which has been documented, I think as we get increasing numbers, then understandably there are then the schools will be the universal agency. They're the port of call for those families from age 5 to 16 plus. And so they're the ones that feel it the most. And then they've got to balance, all of that, and people know, for instance, that more and more children are receiving, free meals. There are, food banks being used more. All of that adds a stress to a family. And then on top of it, school is balancing the expectations of central government in terms of the kind of standards that they want to see in the school. But not only that, I think the accountability has been particularly brutal for schools. So there's obviously the Ofsted accountability, where reports are published and essentially for some schools mean that they are shamed as a result of this. And then there's also the results, the if you like, the measures, the way that children are measured, which have become more and more narrow, some might say.
And is that a frustration for yourself as a professional?
I'd say the effect on staff in schools, I think it causes stress, especially when they keep changing the assessment criteria and then not really giving people the time. They changed the curriculum, introduced a new assessment. Now, that in itself wouldn't be a problem for teachers, but what is a problem is that these results are published and they are named and shamed in some cases. And I think it leads to a lot of stress in the system. I think the curriculum, the assessment would be fine in itself. It's just the way that is used to hold schools to account. And you can imagine that if they are judged by the numbers of children they get to a certain standard, and that has been narrowed and it has been raised somewhat, then you can imagine that for some children it becomes more and more difficult for them to reach what is called the expected standard. And some children, will literally be told that they failed to make the expected standard. And I think that depending on how that's handled and how the parents are able to handle it, can be quite devastating.
It can have presumably a huge impact on their adult life.
Yes, it can. So I think, there are things in schools. I think teachers and schools are remarkably resilient. But I do think that they have had a series of changes imposed upon them, which has made it very difficult for them to attend to some of the, shall we say, the holistic needs of the child. So they all make attempts to, and some are more successful at it than others. But it is extremely challenging, and I think when you've got stressed parents, perhaps through social and economic difficulties that they're encountering, and then you've got a teaching force that feels under a lot of pressure from external accountability factors, then you can see that it creates a lot of stress in the system. And the children that are most sensitive to that will be those who have experienced those kind of social, emotional, economic, and sometimes the mental health difficulties. Yeah.
A huge area then.
It is.
So what now for Gemstones? Do you have particular plans for the next 12 months of the business?
Yes, yeah, we do. We are. We've just published a new prospectus, and we want to provide. I think we've always sought to provide a very tailored, very holistic service for schools, and we really want to kind of build on that and to work with schools to find different ways of supporting their needs. So we work at all levels with leadership teams, with pupils directly, with parents, with teaching assistants and teachers. But I think we also really would like to look for partners who can help us really with the find solutions for schools where they are sometimes expected to take children that have been maybe excluded from more than one school, sent to a PRU, and then are put back in, the idea is they're put back in the school, so those pupils, but also some of those pupils that find themselves out of school because there is no provision at all for them. So that might be because they have been excluded. It could be, and we do sometimes get commissions directly from parents. Sometimes it's parents who have felt so desperate to try and avoid an exclusion that they're considering or have taken their child out of school, and then find that they can't always get another school place for them, or they need to educate themselves at home, and there are increasing numbers of those. So I suppose for those children that schools feel they need really additional help for over a prolonged period of time in some cases, that they would keep them on roll if they could just have them educated in part somewhere else with additional support, which is closer to them than and more accessible to them, because there are a lot of children that just find themselves out of school for quite a long period of time. So these are the kind of problems in the system. The exclusion rates are rising rapidly, and so we're looking for partners who are keen to try and help us find solutions for that group of children.
Okay. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to hearing more of your story in the months and years to come.
Thank you very much.